In 2017, Professor Eric Lamazoff went to the Maryland Law Review to respond to a viral Associated Press article by historian John Meacham. That article drew parallels between Donald Trump's 2016 victory and Andrew Jackson's 2-century-old triumph, one which helped define American democracy. Trump seemed to embrace the comparison, hanging a portrait of the nation's 7th president in the Oval Office. Lamazoff pushed back on Meacham's question, which read, "The moment is Jacksonian, but do we have a Jackson in the Oval Office?" To liken Trump to a latter-day Jackson is simply not the same thing as suggesting that Trump is governing in a Jacksonian moment. While the former focuses on individual traits, the latter describes environmental qualities. Jackson's victory reshaped democracy so thoroughly that his name became synonymous with populist upheaval. Riding a similar wave, Trump entered office hoping to engineer a radical redesign of the republic. 4 years later, he left Washington amid a second impeachment, which left members of his own party calling for justice for January 6, a movement aimed in part at keeping him in power. Lamazoff's 2017 insight proved prescient, but it didn't predict Trump 2.0. Freed from Republican elites, this new version of Trump began reshaping the country aggressively, ignoring tradition and norms. Despite claiming innovation, most of Trump's moves repurpose existing tools for personal gain. Even his slogan, "Make America Great Again," comes from Ronald Reagan. Reagan, an actor turned president, may have seemed a reasonable comparison, but Reagan was pro-free trade, pro-immigration, pro-NATO, and anti-Russian. Ironically, MAGA has now replaced Reagan as the Republican Party's core constituency. Historian Mauricio Valsanzia notes, President Trump may think he's President Jackson reincarnated. As a man and a leader, he likes the brash, confrontational, hyper-masculine, lion-like attitude that characterized the 7th president. Jackson pushed executive power to the limits, just like Trump tries to do. And there is a commonality of philosophical and political visions. The two tap into the same definition of freedom. They both believe the president has freedom from all restraint and from every form of legislative or judicial control. As you can see, the parallels keep piling up. Like Jackson, Trump has been accused of acting like a king, relying on grievance-driven politics, attacking institutions, and distributing government jobs and contracts like spoils. His policies echo the past. Tariffs dominate the headlines. Deportations recall the Trail of Tears. Social media battles with Fed Chair Jerome Powell mirror Jackson's fight with Nicholas Biddle. And a revolving door of Mar-a-Lago advisors recalls Jackson's kitchen cabinet. A full episode could explore the connections between these two men, but the core question remains. Trump is Jacksonian, but will he, like the 7th president, lead a new Democratic era? Are the changes he's pushing lasting, or will they be rolled back by a successor? We don't know the answer, but with so many echoes of the past, it's worth examining what Andrew Jackson brought to Washington. After all, history may not repeat, but it does rhyme. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's 7th president, Andrew Jackson. Episode number 4, The Corrupt Bargain. Jackson became a national hero after the War of 1812. America had been catastrophically unprepared for its second clash with Britain. The plan had been simple: march into Canada and claim victory. But instead, the war sparked the rise of proto-Canadian nationalism. Before Americans could grasp what went wrong, the architects of the campaign were fleeing for their lives as redcoats burned nearly every building in Washington, D.C., all except the Patent Office. Dr. William Thornton literally put his body in front of the British cannons aimed at the workplace. Challenging their honor, he demanded, "Are you Englishmen or Goths and Vandals? This is the Patent Office, the depository of ingenuity of the American nation in which the world is interested. Would you destroy it?" No one made such appeals for the White House. Instead, Dolly Madison, the nation's first lady, fled just 5 hours before the flames consumed the building. Her heroism is remembered for rescuing historically significant items, including the official portrait of George Washington. Francis Scott Key, another War of 1812 hero, was a lawyer on a mission to secure a client's freedom when he was detained aboard a civilian ship. Forced to watch the 25-hour bombardment of Fort McHenry, he penned the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner, capturing how the rocket's red glare, the bomb bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Less often noted is the rest of the poem, which includes pointed commentary on the English failure to free enslaved people in American hands. The lyrics were eventually set to the tune of an Irish drinking song. So if you're keeping track, the heroes of the War of 1812 were a patent officer, a fleeing woman holding a painting, and a lawyer with a fondness for Guinness. To paraphrase former Celtics GM Danny Ainge, George Washington, Marquis Lafayette, and Alexander Hamilton weren't walking through that door. In Jackson's resounding victory at New Orleans, Americans finally saw the war's long-awaited champion. He continued serving in the military after the war. By 1816, Jackson was taking unilateral action against Spain in Florida and its Seminole residents. Historian John Meacham tells us that by 1817, Jackson was able to direct his fire toward two of his great nemesis, Spain and the Indians, at once. The Seminoles declined to leave their lands north of the Florida border. They were supposed to under the terms of Jackson's agreement with the Creeks, and instead fought back, trading bloodbath for bloodbath with the Americans, with the Seminoles escaping to Spanish-held Florida for safety. President Monroe, the third successive Republican Virginian president, issued ambiguous orders Jackson interpreted in the broadest possible way. The result? A full-fledged invasion of Spanish Florida. Remember how I casually mentioned that the Star-Spangled Banner chastised England for interfering with America's peculiar institution of slavery? For Jackson, a slave owner himself, that verse was just as important as the first. Long before the Underground Railroad guided enslaved people to British-held Canada, Florida was the South's most viable escape route. Spain, under pressure from England, banned the African slave trade to its colonies in 1817. The Seminoles, descendants of the ancient Mississippi Basin tribes, had inflated their numbers by welcoming African Americans as full members of their society. Fort Gadsden, in present-day Florida, had been abandoned by the British after the War of 1812. It became home to more than 1,000 black men and their families. In their rush to leave, the British left it fully stocked with guns, cannons, and ammunition. Historian Adam Wasserman notes, "The fort grew from a strategically defensive base to a flourishing black-maroon community, lining the fertile banks of the Apalachicola. They cultivated fields extending 50 miles up the river, using generations of inherited knowledge of West African agricultural techniques." To plantation owners in Georgia and South Carolina, such a paradise was a direct threat. Wasserman continues, writing, "Runaway slaves were pouring in on a daily basis. It was becoming a growing threat to slavery itself." Jackson's approach to Spain was unambiguous. He wrote to the governor, "I have little doubt of the fact that this fort has been established by some villains for rape and plunder, and that it ought to be blown up regardless of the land on which it stands. and if your mind shall have formed the same conclusion, destroy it and return the stolen blacks and property to their rightful owners. Under Jackson's orders, American gunships triggered an explosion that one eyewitness described as beyond description. Of the 330 men, women, and children inside, 270 were killed instantly. White survivors were executed, while black captives were re-enslaved, including a man named Polypore, sent to serve at Jackson's Hermitage home. In retaliation, the Seminoles raided American settlements along the border, giving Jackson cause to seize Spanish territory in Pensacola. Historian Alan Taylor writes, Jackson invaded Florida with 3,000 men to chastise a savage foe, combined with a lawless band of black brigands. After burning Seminole towns, Jackson executed captives, including 2 British men who had remained as independent operators. Jackson treated them as British covert agents, traitors to the white race, unprincipled villains, and unchristianed wretches. Jackson's victories, at the cost of 1,500 American soldiers' lives, ramped up pressure on Spain to negotiate a hasty exit from Florida. It also helped him emerge as a populist figure in Washington. Taylor observes, the federal government refused to censure or remove Jackson. Indeed, the general became even more popular by smiting Britons for aiding Indians and runaway slaves. The British protested the executions, but avoided escalation, unwilling to risk trade. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, son of America's second president, endorsed Jackson's actions, rather than encounter the shock of his popularity. Adams then brokered the agreement that became the Adams-Onis Treaty, formally securing Florida for the United States. That Jackson ended up in this position at all is remarkable. Quincy Adams shared the core beliefs of his Federalist father, beliefs that ran counter to James Monroe's Republican platform. Beneath the War of 1812's external fight against England was an internal civil struggle that effectively ended the first-party system. Federalists in Congress had unanimously opposed the declaration of war and withheld support throughout the fighting. Frustrated by their inability to influence events, key leaders met in secret at what became known as the Hartford Convention. While some argued for secession under a strict states' rights doctrine, the convention ultimately tried to reform the system from within. Their platform included 7 proposed constitutional amendments, designed to ensure the North retained influence in a nation increasingly dominated by Virginians. Jackson's decisive victory at New Orleans didn't just end the war, it destroyed the Federalist Party. In the wave of post-war nationalism, Hartford Convention participants were branded traitors. The party's reputation was so ruined that it failed to field a candidate in the election of 1820, leaving James Monroe to run unopposed. His 2 terms inaugurated the era of good feelings, a brief period where America was united beneath a single political party. Monroe's choice of John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, a former Federalist who had condemned the Hartford Convention, sent a clear signal to the nation. His administration aimed to rise above party politics, prioritizing national purpose over political maneuvering. It worked. Adams negotiated the acquisition of Florida, oversaw the early implementation of the Monroe Doctrine, and pursued a personal passion project, a 245-page report on weights and measures, advocating adoption of the metric system. As a side note, you can purchase that report for just $25 on Amazon, but I'd always encourage checking your local bookstore first. And for those of you suffering from insomnia, sadly there is not an audio edition yet. In the aftermath of the Adams-Onis Treaty, General Jackson was appointed military governor of the Florida Territory. After more than 2 months campaigning against the Seminoles, Jackson wrote to the president, I am at present worn down with fatigue and by a bad cough, with a pain in my left side which produced a spitting of blood, has reduced me to a skeleton. I must have a rest. His acceptance of the position in 1821 was conditional on the fact that he could resign as soon as the territorial government was organized. Jackson moved quickly. In just 2 months, he established a rudimentary territorial government, appointing local officials and creating the framework for civil administration. Courts were convened to enforce U.S. law, even in the face of lingering Spanish influence and resistance from native communities. Settlers were encouraged to register land claims, while Jackson personally oversaw the disarmament of hostile groups and the deportation of runaway enslaved people who had sought refuge among the Seminoles. Forts along the Apalachicola and St. Mary's rivers were strengthened to secure American control. In every action, Jackson demonstrated the same audacity and ruthlessness that had defined his military career, solidifying Florida as an American possession before even the first territorial legislature could convene. Still, Jackson was eager to return home to his wife and to launch his first presidential campaign. He departed for Tennessee after organizing the territory, leaving behind a newly secured Florida and a blueprint for U.S. governance in a region that had only recently shifted from Spanish to American control. Keep in mind that American democracy was still an experiment at this point. Washington's farewell address had set an informal precedent for a 2-term limit in 1797. In 1803, the 12th Amendment redesigned how vice presidents were selected after Aaron Burr had attempted to kill his running mate. State legislatures still selected U.S. senators, allowing Andrew Jackson a brief return to Washington during the campaign. And party primaries weren't even under consideration in 1824, as there was just one party vying for the presidency. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans cruised through the era of good feelings, having placed 3 consecutive Virginians in the White House. Monroe, having served 2 consecutive terms, stepped down and refused to endorse a successor. His decision to keep his thumb off the political scales allowed the Richmond Inquirer to claim in 1820 that voters were to be treated to a war of the giants. But the reality was more complicated. Historian James Chase argues that Monroe's 2 terms signaled extinction, not revitalization of the Republican Party. Without an opposition party, the Republicans' ideological underpinnings and policy positions lost coherence. The party had become so inconclusive it imploded into factions. And these divisions in turn virtually invited, perhaps even demanded, competing visions. Historian Daniel Feller adds, 3 seasoned members of Monroe's cabinet vied for the succession: Secretary of State John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, Secretary of the Treasury William Harris Crawford of Georgia, and Secretary of War John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Henry Clay of Kentucky, the brilliant Speaker of the House of Representatives and a rival of Jackson's for popularity in the new western states, was also an aspirant. Compared to these men, Jackson had scantly qualifications as a statesman, with only brief and undistinguished service in Congress and as a territorial governor, where all presidents since Washington had served extensive administrative and diplomatic apprenticeships. Jackson had never held a cabinet post or even been abroad. He spoke no foreign languages and even wrote English roughly. On the other hand, his heroics as a general had a far greater hold on the public imagination than the governmental experience of his competitors. In modern terms, Jackson was the only outsider in a race crowded with Washington insiders. Crawford had the party's official nomination, but our focus will be on John Quincy Adams, the eventual winner, and the 3 other candidates whom Taylor groups together under the chapter title, Monsters. The first monster up is John C. Calhoun. The South Carolinian was one of the two war hawks who had pushed the United States into the War of 1812. By the 1820s, he underwent a remarkable political transformation, moving from a nationalist, pro-tariff federalist to a man whose name would become synonymous with both the institution of slavery and the doctrine of nullification. 4 men had declined the position of Secretary of War before Calhoun accepted it. A reform-minded modernizer, he immediately set to work establishing coastal fortresses and building up the nation's navy. Born on a cotton farm, educated at Yale, and backed financially by his wealthy cousin, who would also become his wife, Calhoun argued that slavery was a positive good for those caught up in the peculiar institution. In 1837, he expressed it bluntly: "I appeal to fact. Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically but morally and intellectually." Slavery wasn't a disqualifier in this era of American politics, but Calhoun lacked the charisma to run a national campaign. Taylor notes, harder working than Clay, Calhoun was less likable. Legalistic, learned, and humorless, Calhoun lacked imagination beyond political theory. A joke insisted that he had tried to compose a poem, but could not get past his first word, whereas. Clay described Calhoun as a cast-iron man who looks as if he had never been born. To my students, he looks exactly like Willem Dafoe. The second monster in the story is Henry Clay of Kentucky. For 40 consecutive years, Clay wielded extraordinary influence in Washington, far beyond what might be expected from a frontier state. Beloved across party lines, even by Jackson Adams and Calhoun, he claimed the speakership of the House for 6 terms, and served a cumulative 10 years and 196 days in the House, the second longest tenure in U.S. history. Taylor observes, his charisma compensated for a homely but likable face and lank, rambling gait. He fought duels, flirted shamelessly, drank heavily, told wry jokes, and played cards and the fiddle. A war hawk like Calhoun, Clay earned the title of the Great Compromiser for his role in negotiating the Treaty of Ghent, the Missouri Compromise, and the Compromise of 1850. Like Jackson and Calhoun, Clay was a slave owner, but he was unusually vocal about the evils of the institution. He threw his considerable political and financial support behind the American Colonization Society, which aimed to repatriate black people to Africa, removing both slavery and free black communities from the United States. In 1824, however, Clay's focus was on one overriding idea: the American system. This economic program sought to foster national development through protective tariffs, internal improvements, and the establishment of a strong national bank. It was an ambitious vision of economic nationalism, one that set him apart from Jackson and Calhoun, and that would dominate the campaign that year. Quincy Adams doesn't factor into the chapter title of Monsters. He attempted to distinguish himself from his opponents by speaking of his integrity and long history of public service. In Boston, he told supporters, "By voting for the Adams ticket, you give your support to that candidate for the office of President of the United States who is most experienced, best qualified, and in every respect most worthy." To Maine voters, he highlighted his splendid talents and incorruptible integrity, and lumped his opponents together, pointing out that each had disobeyed the divine command of "thou shalt not murder" by dueling their foes. As the son of a vice president and the sitting Secretary of State, Adams was the best-known candidate. He hoped his record would keep the campaign above the fray. But as political scientist Everett Brown observed in 1925, the basis of the selection of the candidates was personal rather than political. That reality meant the candidates and their supporters had to get down into the streets, where the mud would inevitably fly. Jackson, of course, both gave and received the worst of it. The Constitutional Rights Foundation notes that the campaign quickly heated up, becoming America's first great mudslinging contest. Jackson was called a gambler, duelist, adulterer, and military tyrant. Clay was called a drunkard and gambler. Adams was ridiculed for his slovenly dress. Crawford was attacked for dishonesty and mismanaging the budget. Historian David Calhoun wrote that the 1824 candidates discovered novel ways of electioneering without seeming to electioneer. They built organizations of elite politicians using correspondence, patronage, and social occasions to forge bonds with their supporters. They constructed newspaper networks, staged congressional legislative fights over issues, and spread unflattering rumors about their rivals to carry their message to voters. Led by cabinet secretaries, nearly every aspect of politics in the 4 years of Monroe's second term became enmeshed in a perpetual campaign for the succession. Even though the frontrunner, Crawford, suffered a stroke that left him incapacitated, his campaign carried on, led by Martin Van Buren, the first American to truly understand modern democratic electioneering. Jackson ran as the classic outsider. That status became a shield, allowing him to dismiss his opponent's attacks as mere politics and speak directly to frontier Americans. While his rivals accused Crawford of grossly duping his fellow citizens, Jackson assured voters that he would support the devil before the Treasury Secretary. The other candidates had underestimated the political climate. Calhoun explains, his distractors labeled him as a dangerous, insubordinate, and ruthless dictator without constitutional scruples. His dramatic victory in the Battle of New Orleans had transformed Jackson into a celebrity hero, granting him access to the 1824 contest. Since his opponents considered him unqualified for office anyway, there was little upside to attacking the popular war hero, who was, in their minds, unlikely to win. But in an era of real political corruption and economic anxiety following the Panic of 1819, Jackson's lack of traditional presidential credentials worked in his favor. Sam Houston endorsed the general, explaining, "At a time when her watchmen had been caught slumbering on post, her capital had been reduced to ashes, Jackson had been her faithful guardian. Will not the nation look to him again?" Seizing the theme of corruption, Jackson leaned into a Cincinnatus-like persona, telling voters, "Had I a choice, I would prefer a retired life on my farm." Calhoun notes that the era's policy clashes, toxic partisanship, financial disasters, and bitter sectionalism certainly stoked the widespread discontent roiling the electorate, but wistful memories also added to its disaffection. With the 50th anniversary of the Revolution looming and most of the founders dead or long retired, many Americans dwelled nostalgically on their heroic past. No one embodied that connection to the Revolutionary era like Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory had once been a boy who refused to polish a redcoat's boots, and now, decades later, he was poised to capture the public imagination in a way that insiders like Adams, Clay, and Calhoun could not. By the final stretch of the election, Jackson, now a sitting senator, was in close proximity to his rivals. Calhoun observes, their sustained dismissal of Jackson's candidacy left his opponents suddenly scrambling for a strategy to blunt his mounting popularity. Adams attempted to sideline him by floating a rumor that Jackson might accept the vice presidency. When it polled well, Adams hosted a party complete with banners reading, "Welcome to the Hero of New Orleans." The party was attended by more than 1,000 guests. But Jackson, increasingly confident, wasn't the type to subordinate his will to another. The mudslinging intensified, but Jackson knew the attacks would ultimately backfire. He told supporters that the personal assaults would elect him contrary to their wishes by their abuse. elections in the United States have always been controlled by the states. In 1824, rather than voting on a single day, the election took place over a 34-day window set by Congress. Presidential electors were chosen by popular vote in 18 states, while 6 states still let their legislatures pick the men who would ultimately determine the president. Jackson went from underdog to favorite when Pennsylvania declared for him. His victory was no accident. It came from careful, targeted work canvassing the state with pro-Jackson newspapers. Support came from all levels of the Keystone State's populace, but it was the small farmers, miners, rivermen, and mechanics who made the difference. In a fittingly grassroots gesture, the electors even chose a bartender to notify Andrew Jackson of their decision. Despite the intense personal nature of the campaign, voter turnout remained low. Only 27% of eligible voters cast ballots. Regional loyalties largely determined the results, reflecting the fractured political landscape. John C. Calhoun, sensing a better path to power, dropped out before Election Day. He ended up securing a spot on both Adams and Jackson's tickets for vice president, positioning himself just one heartbeat away from the presidency, regardless of who won. Jackson captured the most electoral votes across 12 states, totaling 99, closely followed by John Quincy Adams with 84. Adams's support came primarily from Federalist-leaning states in the Northeast, with small gains in Louisiana and Illinois. Crawford, still recovering from a stroke, finished third with 41 electoral votes, concentrated in Virginia, Delaware, and his home state of Georgia. Henry Clay, despite finishing last, carried Kentucky, Missouri, and Ohio. The 12th Amendment, often noted for pairing presidential and vice presidential candidates on a single ticket, also provides the process for the House of Representatives to decide an election if no candidate secures a majority of the electoral vote. Today, that magic number is 270. In 1824, it was 131, leaving Andrew Jackson 32 votes short of the presidency. I can think of no greater calamity to befall this nation than an election going to the House of Representatives in the modern era. The first election I cast a vote for was Bush-Gore, which ultimately ended up in the hands of the Supreme Court. I still vividly remember the confusion and outrage. Al Gore won the popular vote, yet lost the presidency. I've been a social studies teacher for every election since, explaining the idiosyncrasies of the American system. Nothing throws the process into more turmoil than a viable third-party candidate. If such a candidate wins one or two medium-sized states, the election could easily be thrown to the House. And even then, it's far more complicated than simply having representatives vote along party lines, as each state casts just one vote, and the winner needs a majority of states, 26 today. Andrew Jackson expected the presidency. He had the most electoral votes and had won the popular vote. But the House of Representatives was a battlefield Jackson wasn't prepared for. Taylor explains, with his primary support in the South, Jackson benefited from the federal Constitution's 3/5 clause. Without it, Adams would have led in the Electoral College by 83 to 77 votes. Jackson was the candidate of slavery as well as democracy. The 12th Amendment invited only the top 3 candidates to advance to this absurd runoff. Jackson, who had thrived as an outsider, now had to convince the Washington elite, the epitome of political insiders, that he was the right man to lead them. Taylor continues, in lobbying Congressman, Adams had the advantage over Jackson of greater familiarity as a Washington insider. Jackson's militarism and violence also unnerved legislators. Clay worried that the general would become a dictator and lead the nation onto the fatal road which has conducted every other republic to ruin. Clay, the eliminated 4th candidate, rejected Jackson's hints of a cabinet position and became kingmaker. As Speaker of the House, he controlled the scheduling of the runoff. Well known as a master schemer, it was said of him that he always knew precisely which backs to pat and which knees to break to achieve his legislative goals. Jackson, Adams, and Crawford all courted Clay for influence over 3 critical states that had gone for the candidate from Kentucky. Calhoun explains, the nature of each man's bid for Clay's support revealed their different strategies. The victorious candidate needed a simple majority of states, 13 of 24. Crawford had won only 3 states, so he faced a long climb, relying on partisan appeals to elite politicians. Jackson shifted tactics, emphasizing Western regionalism. He had won 11 states. If he could hold those and add 2 of Clay's Western victories, he would come out on top. Adams had triumphed in 7 states and needed every bit of deal-making skill to add 6 more. Tellingly, by appealing to Clay's own future interests, he was the only candidate to overtly suggest that the Speaker might get a job in his forthcoming administration. Crawford's representatives kept his states in play, hoping to deadlock the House enough that every state would turn to him as the second-choice candidate. Jackson, with disdain for both Clay and Crawford, refused to compromise. In his words, the people have the right to choose the chief executive of the nation. In his mind, they had already spoken. During this second phase of the election, Washington elites began whispering about Rachel Jackson's morality, citing her brief marriage to another man decades earlier. The rumor sickened Jackson. Given his temper and belief in protecting women, it's shocking he didn't challenge everyone in Washington to duels. Instead, he feigned indifference, trying to deny the rumors the oxygen that they needed to survive. Meanwhile, Adams met with congressional delegations from 17 states. Unbeknownst to him, delegations from Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri, Illinois, and Louisiana had secretly agreed to vote together. 3 had originally gone for Clay. 2 had gone for Jackson. On the frontier, Illinois and Missouri each had just one representative controlling the state vote. Coordinating with the others shielded them from political fallout. Clay and Kentucky were key to the coalition. By accepting a backroom deal, Secretary of State under Adams for Clay, and support for his American system, the Speaker of the House swung his influence, though he truly feared a Jackson presidency. At the time, the Secretary of State was widely seen as the traditional conduit to the presidency. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and now Adams had all held the office before ascending to the White House. Clay, the youngest candidate, could wait his turn while building his resume. The official meeting occurred in Adams's office at 6 p.m. on January 9, 1825. Both men claimed no quid pro quo occurred, but everyone in Washington believed otherwise. 8 days later, Clay introduced the first piece of legislation for his American system: federal funds to extend the national road through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri, the 4 western states Adams needed to flip. A year earlier, Northeast states had rejected a similar bill. This time, at Adams' urging, they passed it by a substantial margin. Next came a bill to fund the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. Again, New England switched its vote. Jackson erupted, labeling Clay a modern-day Judas and claiming the Speaker had sold out for his 30 pieces of silver. His followers agreed, burning 153 effigies of Clay. The Kentuckian, unfazed, shrugged, "I should never have selected Adams if at liberty to draw from the whole mass of our citizens. But there is no danger in his elevation. Not so of his competitor. I cannot believe that killing 2,500 Englishmen at New Orleans qualifies for the various difficult and complicated duties of the chief magistracy." Securing the West, Adams leveraged his sudden frontrunner status and hidden Federalist credentials to claw back New York and Delaware, solidifying his House victory. The official vote occurred on February 9, 1825, 106 days after eligible voters had traveled to the polls to have their voices heard. True to his word, Clay delivered the electoral votes of Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri, and Louisiana. Maryland also flipped, meaning that with his 6 New England states, John Quincy Adams was just 1 vote shy of the presidency. It all came down to New York's Stephen Van Rensselaer. Timing likely played a role, as the New Yorker had flip-flopped throughout the election. He had shifted from supporting Calhoun to Crawford during the general election, then publicly declared for Jackson during the House vote, before ultimately promising to follow Clay's lead. After a private meeting with the Speaker, he kept his final word, casting the decisive vote that made John Quincy Adams the 6th President of the United States of America. Andrew Jackson did not vanish from the political scene. He carried the rage of the corrupt bargain with him for the next 4 years. Yearning for a rematch, Jackson funneled his energy into a campaign and strategy that would ensure such a betrayal could never stand. That crusade laid the groundwork for the first truly modern political campaign. His eventual victory would inaugurate Jacksonian democracy as he bent the nation to his iron will, reshaping the presidency and American politics for generations. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handles EmpirePod. If you'd like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.